Hi, I'm Steve McCammon. I'm on the board at Sisters, and I'm also a member of the Finance and Budget Committee. I'm going to talk today to you about some things that I think will be of importance that you should know as a member of the board, and that will hopefully help you understand a little bit about the finances at Sisters and how we operate there. The two main areas that I think you should keep in mind as a board member, one is more of a general area and the other is more specific, but in terms of the general area, as a board member, you're charged with the idea of keeping track of is Sisters accomplishing their goals, and that also you're to make sure that that the operations are in place to meet those goals, and also to provide the resources such as personnel and finances to accomplish those goals, and finally to give direction and vision in accomplishing the goals. So that's the big broad picture. Within that, the second area, the more specific area, has to do with the finances. And you are charged with a fiduciary capacity to make sure the finances are being handled correctly. And so in terms of financing, we want to make sure that the activities are being handled properly and there's accountability. So that is your charge in terms of the board and in terms of finances. As we go through this today, I want you to also keep in mind that you can ask questions. I don't care how specific or how general or how small or how large the questions are. You should be asking questions, as a matter of fact. If you don't ask the questions, shame on you. So let's go. First of all, I want to talk about the types of reports that you're going to see at the board meetings, and we'll talk about a little bit about each one and specifics of each report. First thing you're going to see is a balance sheet. Some people are not familiar with a balance sheet, but a balance sheet essentially says on a certain date that's what we own in the way of assets and what we owe in the way of liabilities. So for example, at Sisters, most of our assets are tied up in cash. They're tied up in contracts receivable, foundation grants and so forth, receivable, and then finally fixed assets. That's the equipment, that's the personal center, that's the desk, that's the computers, that sort of thing. So those are our assets. Those are the things that we own. To offset that, if we have any debts against those assets, they will show up, or if we have just expenses and operating debts, so such as accounts payable, we may have accrued liabilities for taxes, which we don't pay taxes, but so those kinds of things would be on the debt side. And hopefully we have more assets than we do liabilities, and that's called equity or net worth. So as an example, if you own a home and the home is, say, worth $100,000, and the debt against that home is $80,000, you would have equity of $20,000. So our net worth is made up of those kinds of assets, and mostly cash, which is a good thing for us. So the balance sheet is the first thing you're going to see every month in the board packet. The second thing you're going to see is a profit and loss statement. Profit and loss statement is going to encompass the revenues that we receive as well as the expenses. And hopefully we bring in more revenues and then we have expenses, because if it's the other way around, then we're losing money. So be aware of it and watch what kinds of revenues that we have. The revenues that we receive are from grants, from foundations, from fundraisers, from contracts, from donations, and those kinds of things. That's where we get our money from. Every year, it's always a challenge to raise the money to operate on and to provide the financing for our programs. So that's the big unknown every year, is the revenue side. On the other side, the expense side, we budget for those expenses every month, and the biggest expense item is the personnel. That's a huge item for Sisters and for most nonprofits. It's a very, very large item. So we do a really good job of budgeting for expenses every year. So we look at the revenue, hopefully it's more than the expenses, and then what's left over is hopefully money that we can put into a rainy day fund or into our reserve account. One thing about nonprofits, for most nonprofits, if they just bring in just enough money to cover expenses, that's really good. In today's economic environment, a lot of the nonprofits are not bringing in enough money, so they're having to cut back on their programs. We at Sisters have been fortunate. We have a good donor base, we have good grants, foundations that support us. And so generally we come out either break even or even actually have a little money left over, which we put into reserves. One thing we should watch as board members when we look at revenue is to make sure we don't have revenue that's stacked into one area or another. So the revenues should be spread out and fairly distributed amongst the different categories. So as a board member, you want to watch that to make sure we don't get too dependent on one or two sources of revenues. As I said, it's really important that we have fewer expenses than revenues, and so that's the other thing you want to watch every month. And quite honestly, with Sisters, we have a very seasonal, very predictable supply of revenue in the way it comes in during the year, and our expenses. Expenses are fairly routine every month. They don't change much, but our supply of revenue does change dramatically. Our fiscal year is from July 1 to June 30th. So the first quarter, which would be July, August, September, we have pretty much a break even. In fact, we have a little bit more expenses than revenues, but it's a fairly close for that first quarter. The second quarter, as you can imagine, in November and December, we have huge amounts of revenue that come in. So that quarter, we're really doing well. The next two quarters, the third and the fourth quarter, we go back to where we're spending more than we have revenues. So this is a very typical, predictable supply and demand on terms of revenue and expenses for the organization. So it's okay in some months to have losses because those are predictable and we know that's going to happen. But we make up for it in those months in November, December when we have large amounts of revenue come in. So for the year, we usually come out of break even or even a little bit better than break even. So you want to watch those cycles in the seasonality of the revenues and expenses. When the trends change from what I just described, then as a board member, you want to start asking questions. What's going on? Why are we not bringing in enough revenue? Why are we having higher expenses? And those are the kind of questions you want to ask. So those are the kind of reports you're going to see every month in the board packet. The balance sheet, the profit and loss statement, and then those things that go with that. Now, one thing about the balance sheet, that's just a snapshot picture on that one day that balance sheet's produced. With the profit and loss statement, that's over a period of time. It's cumulative. The revenues and the expenses are year to date. So those are two things you want to keep in mind. The next thing I want to talk to you briefly about is our banking relationship. Sisters is blessed. We have good relationships with our banks, and at the present time we have a checking account which is used for operating expenses, to pay operating expenses, the salaries, the wages, utilities, and that sort of thing. We also have two relationships with other financial institutions where we keep our reserves, and those are money market accounts that actually earn interest for us. And then lastly, we have a bank line of credit, which we could use in case of emergency. We very seldom use that because we do have reserves, and sometimes we use those reserves rather than borrow the money at the bank. But we do have reserves, and we do have a bank line of credit, and we do have a very predictable seasonality to the revenues and expenses. So all in all, we're pretty well financially sound, and we do a good job of budgeting and tracking the trends in expenses. The last thing I want to talk to you about is budgeting, and again, our calendar year, our fiscal year rather, is from July 1 to June 30th, so the budget process starts along in the fall, and we work our way through that, and eventually we get it approved in the May-June board meetings. Each department is charged with the responsibility of coming up with their budget figures, and then we compile that. And it goes to the Budget and Finance Committee, where it's looked at line by line, and questions are asked, test the assumptions, and talk about what goes up to make up the budget. And once that passes the Budget and Finance Committee, then we bring it to the board for final approval. So when you're sitting there as a board member, you want to keep in mind the big picture, what you're charged with, and don't get caught up too much in the details of the line items that you see there, because the Finance and the Budget Committee have already looked at those and asked the questions. The budget is a good way to remember it is that it's a roadmap. So it's a way to get from point A to point B. Point A being July 1, point B being June 30th. And as we go along that roadmap, we want to track our progress. And so the budget every month is included in the board report. and we compare the actuals year to date against the budget. And so when we start seeing big variances, we want to ask questions, well, what's happened, what's going on, why are we not on track, and why are we not on that roadmap? So those are other questions you might want to ask as you look at your board packet each month. And lastly, it's really important that, that the board be informed timely of anything that changes in the world of finance for Sisters, and you should be asking questions. It's your responsibility to do that. Now, it's your responsibility to ask sort of the bigger questions. It's the responsibility of the Finance and the Budget Committee to look at the more detailed questions.